At 30,000 feet, arrogance sounds a lot like confidence over the radio. First Lieutenant Ryan Cole adjusted his oxygen mask and leaned back into the sleek, humming cockpit of his F-35 Lightning II, the canopy above him reflecting a hard blue Kansas sky. The turbine's steady whine vibrated through the seat, a familiar pulse that felt like authority itself. Off his right wingtip, another F-35 held formation, silver gray and sharp against the morning light. It was a routine airspace coordination drill near a civilian corridor, nothing glamorous, nothing historic. Just another training block to log before lunch. Razor 2-1, maintain holding pattern. Civilian traffic has priority clearance. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through his headset, calm and controlled. Ryan frowned slightly. Priority clearance. For a commercial jet lumbering along at 500 miles per hour. He toggled his mic. Copy. Holding. He replied, though the edge in his tone didn't quite hide his annoyance. He glanced at his digital display as a transponder tag blinked into view. A wide-body passenger aircraft cruising steady at 30,000 feet. Call sign civilian. Nothing special. Special passenger on board. ATC added after a brief pause. Ryan smirked beneath the mask. Special passenger. At 30,000 feet, everyone thought they were special. 30 miles away and a world apart inside seat 16A of that commercial flight. Daniel Whitaker sat with his hands folded neatly over a worn leather jacket resting on his lap. He looked like any other retired grandfather heading home from a visit. White hair trimmed short, shoulders slightly stooped, eyes fixed quietly on the wing outside his window. The sunlight caught the aluminum edge of the wing as it flexed gently against a thin band of cirrus clouds. Around him, passengers murmured over half-finished sodas and glowing phone screens switched to airplane mode. A flight attendant, Laura Mitchell, moved steadily down the aisle, her practiced smile calm despite a subtle tremor that rippled through the cabin. The aircraft shifted again, not violently, but enough for a few nervous glances to lift toward the ceiling. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, but in calculation. He watched the cloud layers, the faint shimmer along the engine housing, the way the wingtip light blinked against the haze. The movement of air told a story most people never learned to read. In the cockpit, the airline captain monitored a minor advisory light flickering briefly. On the panel, nothing urgent, just an irregular sensor reading that required observation. Probably a pressure fluctuation, the first officer muttered, running a checklist. Back in the F-35, Ryan rolled his shoulders and checked his fuel status, irritation fading into boredom. Razor 2-1, stand by for possible escort instruction, ATC said suddenly. Ryan blinked. Escort, he repeated under his breath. His wingman's voice came across the private channel. Guess your special passenger's more important than we thought. Ryan let out a short laugh. It's a commercial flight. What are we escorting? Frequent flyer miles. The radio went silent for half a beat longer than normal. In seat 16A, Daniel Whitaker shifted slightly as another faint shudder passed through the fuselage. His hand rose just an inch, fingertips brushing the armrest as if feeling for something beyond the metal skin of the aircraft. 30,000 feet above the American heartland, 3 different cockpits, 2 military, 1 civilian, floated in the same cold sky, separated by miles of air and decades of experience. And somewhere between routine and revelation, a name long buried in static was about to return to the frequency. The seatbelt sign chimed softly as the aircraft encountered another subtle ripple of unstable air, not severe enough to cause alarm, but persistent enough to unsettle the rhythm of the cabin. And Laura Mitchell steadied herself against the galley wall before offering a reassuring smile to the nearest row, her training telling her to project calm even when the instruments in the cockpit were telling a slightly different story. In the flight deck, the advisory light flickered again, then cleared, then returned with a soft amber glow that did not demand immediate action but refused to be ignored. The captain adjusted the autopilot settings and glanced at his first officer, who was already scrolling through system data with growing concentration. Cabin pressure differential is within limits, the first officer said carefully, but the sensor is reading fluctuations near the outflow valve. The captain nodded, professional and composed, yet aware that at 30,000 feet, even small inconsistencies could grow complicated if left misunderstood. In seat 16A, Daniel Whitaker observed the wing once more, this time noticing a faint oscillation in the trailing edge that did not match the turbulence pattern outside. His eyes shifted toward the ceiling panel as he felt a subtle change in airflow pressure against his ears, a sensation most passengers dismissed as ordinary discomfort. He waited through one more vibration cycle before gently raising his hand to signal Laura. She approached with the polite patience reserved for elderly travelers. "Sir, are you comfortable?" she asked quietly. Daniel offered a small nod before speaking in a voice steady and unhurried. "There is a pressure variation near the aft section. It is minor, but it will repeat every 40 seconds if the valve is sticking." Laura blinked, unsure how to respond to such specific language from a man in a civilian seat. "The captain is aware of a sensor alert," she replied diplomatically. Daniel inclined his head. "Of course he is. But the sensor is not the problem. The airflow is." There was no arrogance in his tone, only calm certainty. In the cockpit, the captain tapped the communication switch. "Cabin crew, confirm any unusual readings in the aft galley." Laura hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pressed her interphone. "Captain, a passenger is suggesting airflow irregularity tied to the outflow valve." The first officer exchanged a look with the captain. "A passenger," he repeated quietly. Outside, Lieutenant Ryan Cole circled in a holding pattern, the horizon stretching clean and bright beyond his canopy. "Razor 2-1, remain in position," air traffic control instructed again, the voice now carrying an undertone of alertness. Ryan's irritation returned as he watched the civilian aircraft on his display. "What exactly are we waiting for?" he muttered, though he kept his tone professional on the channel. Back in the cabin, Daniel felt the vibration return precisely on schedule. He closed his eyes for half a breath, counting the interval as if listening to a metronome only he could hear. When he opened them, there was something different in his expression, not concern, not fear, but recognition. He leaned slightly toward Laura once more. "If the captain would like assistance," he said evenly, "tell him Daniel Whitaker has managed this profile before." The name meant nothing in the aisle at that moment, but 30,000 feet above the planes, repetition was building toward revelation, and somewhere in the invisible current between aircraft and command, a frequency long silent was preparing to speak again. The interphone clicked softly as Laura relayed the name to the cockpit, and for a brief second there was only the low hum of avionics and controlled breathing on the other. And before the captain responded with measured curiosity, "Ask the passenger if he has prior flight experience," he said evenly, not dismissive, not yet convinced. Laura returned to seat 16A, where Daniel Whitaker sat as steady as the wing outside his window, the faint vibration returning exactly on the interval he had predicted. "Sir," she began, her tone respectful now, "the captain would like to know your background." Daniel's eyes shifted from the cloud layer to her face. "United States Air Force, retired," he replied without emphasis. "Transport Command. High-altitude emergency protocols." He did not elaborate, and he did not boast. He simply stated facts as if they belonged to someone else. Another subtle tremor moved through the cabin, and this time a few overhead bins rattled faintly, drawing nervous glances from passengers who had no language for what they were feeling. In the cockpit, the advisory flickered again, and the first officer exhaled slowly. "Pressure differential is cycling every 40 seconds, he said. The captain paused, then keyed the interphone. "Bring him forward." Laura blinked once, surprised by how quickly the decision came, then nodded. Daniel rose carefully, steadying himself with the seat back, his movements unhurried despite the altitude and the murmuring cabin. As he walked the aisle, no one paid special attention. He looked like an aging traveler responding to a routine request, but in his eyes there was focus sharpened by decades. Outside, Lieutenant Ryan Cole received another instruction from air traffic control, the tone now unmistakably serious. "Razor 2-1, maintain proximity. Stand by for further tasking." Ryan frowned beneath his helmet. "Copy," he answered, though his curiosity had replaced irritation. He adjusted his heading slightly to keep the civilian aircraft within visual range, sunlight flashing across its fuselage. In the cockpit of the commercial jet, Daniel stepped inside and took in the instrument panel with one sweeping glance. Digital screens had replaced analog dials since his years in uniform, but airflow did not change with technology. The outflow valve is not responding smoothly, he said calmly, pointing toward a secondary indicator. It is lagging behind the pressure command. You are compensating with autopilot trim, which is why the oscillation repeats. The first officer stared at him, surprised by the accuracy of the observation. The captain studied Daniel's face for a long second. You have seen this before, he said quietly. Daniel gave the slightest nod. At 30,000 feet, small delays become large patterns. The aircraft shuddered once more, slightly stronger this time, and Daniel reached toward the console, not touching, but indicating. Manual override for 2 cycles, he suggested. The captain hesitated only briefly before adjusting the setting. The oscillation diminished almost immediately, the vibration smoothing into a steady glide. The advisory light faded to gray. In the F-35 cockpit miles away, Ryan watched as the civilian aircraft stabilized its altitude, unaware that inside that distant cabin a quiet recalibration had just occurred. Back in the commercial cockpit, the captain exhaled slowly, eyes still on Daniel. You said transport command, he repeated. Daniel looked out through the windshield at the endless American sky. Yes, he answered softly. Then, after a beat that felt heavier than the altitude, he added, they used to call me Hawk 6. The name settled in the cockpit like a frequency long dormant, and somewhere beyond the glass and cloud, radios were about to carry it farther than anyone in that moment could imagine. The name did not echo loudly inside the cockpit, yet it carried a weight that neither pilot could immediately measure. Hawk 6. The captain felt the syllables settle somewhere deeper than procedure, somewhere older than the digital screens glowing across the instrument panel. He glanced at the first officer, who was already scanning through archived memory rather than manuals. Hawk 6, the captain repeated quietly, as if testing the sound against something half-remembered. Daniel Whitaker did not elaborate. He simply stood steady behind the seats, one hand resting lightly against the bulkhead, eyes forward on the horizon line where pale blue met brighter sky. Outside, the aircraft cut cleanly through thin cloud layers, the previous oscillation now reduced to a stable, even glide. In the distance, 2 small gray silhouettes maintained formation, barely visible against the sunlight. In the F-35 cockpit, Lieutenant Ryan Cole adjusted his zoom and caught a clearer image of the commercial jet ahead. Razor 2-1, update, he requested over the secure channel. Air traffic control responded after a measured pause. Stand by, confirm proximity, and maintain escort readiness. The word escort lingered differently this time. Ryan's wingman shifted slightly off his right side, both fighters holding a disciplined distance. Inside the commercial cockpit, the captain keyed the radio. Kansas City Center, this is Pacifica 472. We have stabilized a minor pressure. Variance. Be advised we have a retired Air Force transport pilot on board who assisted with corrective input. There was a brief crackle of static, then silence that lasted 1 beat too long. Pacifica 472, confirm name of assisting pilot, the controller asked, voice now sharper. The captain glanced back at Daniel. Daniel met his eyes calmly. Daniel Whitaker, he said. Then, after a breath that carried decades within it, call sign Hawk 6. The transmission carried across open sky in less than a second. In a dim operations room miles away, a civilian air defense liaison froze with his hand hovering above a keyboard. He leaned closer to his headset, as if the past had just spoken directly into his ear. Repeat call sign, he requested quietly. Back in the cockpit, the captain complied. Hawk 6. The liaison's chair rolled backward with a sudden scrape against polished floor. He reached for a separate line, one that did not ring often. In the F-35, Ryan heard only fragments through coordination chatter, but he caught the repetition of a name that shifted the tone of every voice that followed. Razor flight, maintain position, came the next directive, this time routed through a different authority. The cadence had changed. Formal, measured, intentional. Ryan felt a subtle tightening in his chest, the instinctive awareness that routine had just stepped aside for something else. In the commercial cockpit, Daniel's gaze drifted briefly toward the side window where sunlight flared against the wingtip. The aircraft felt steady now, responsive, balanced. He did not smile, but there was recognition in his eyes, as if a familiar altitude had returned. Behind layers of civilian airspace and military frequency, calls were already moving upward, traveling through channels that remembered a winter decades earlier when a transport aircraft had descended through severe conditions carrying 164 souls who had no idea how close they had come to silence. And at 30,000 feet above the American heartland, the sky was beginning to answer a name it had not heard in years. In a secured office lined with muted monitors and framed squadron photographs, a colonel who had not flinched in 25 years felt his posture change at the second repetition of the call sign. He stood slowly from behind his desk, the chair rolling back with deliberate control rather than surprise. "Confirmed source," he said evenly to the operations specialist beside him. "Commercial flight, cruising at 30,000 feet, civilian registry," the specialist replied, fingers steady over the console. "Passenger identified as Daniel Whitaker. Call sign Hawk 6. The colonel's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. Around him, younger officers glanced at one another, sensing a shift in gravity without yet understanding it. The colonel turned toward the large digital map of regional airspace glowing on the wall. Two F-35 fighters held a clean arc near the commercial aircraft, their icons sharp against the grid. "Route the confirmation to Air Defense Command," he instructed, "and notify General Marcus Hale." The name traveled upward faster than the aircraft moved forward. In the F-35 cockpit, Lieutenant Ryan Cole heard his call sign again through a new channel, this time carried by a voice he recognized as command level. "Razor 2-1, maintain visual escort. Further instruction pending." Escort. The word no longer sounded casual. Ryan adjusted his heading with smooth precision, closing distance carefully without crossing safety protocols. He caught a clearer view of the airliner now, sunlight washing across its fuselage in a calm silver sheen. Nothing about it looked historic. Nothing looked extraordinary. Yet the air around it felt different, charged not with danger, but with meaning. Inside the commercial cockpit, the captain returned to standard monitoring as system readings remained stable. He looked once more at Daniel Whitaker, who stood quietly as if he had simply pointed out a loose hinge rather than corrected a high-altitude anomaly. "We appreciate the assist," the captain said sincerely. Daniel inclined his head. "It is a good crew," he replied. "You corrected quickly." There was no trace of pride in his tone, only professional acknowledgement. He stepped back toward the cabin, leaving the cockpit as quietly as he had entered. As he walked the aisle, a few passengers glanced up without knowing why their aircraft now felt smoother, more assured. Laura watched him with a new awareness, the earlier assumption replaced by curiosity edged with respect. Outside, the F-35 fighters tightened their formation subtly, aligning with the airliner's wing line in disciplined symmetry. In a command vehicle already moving toward the runway at a nearby base, General Marcus Hale listened to a concise briefing delivered over speaker. The moment he heard the name, he closed his eyes briefly, as if aligning memory with present coordinates. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes, sir," came the response. "Identity verified." The general opened his eyes and looked out at the clear American sky stretching beyond the windshield. "Then we will not treat this as routine," he said quietly. Back at 30,000 feet, Daniel Whitaker returned to seat 16A and fastened his seat belt with steady hands. He looked out at the horizon where two faint gray shapes now held position with unwavering discipline. He did not ask for an escort. He did not expect one. But the sky remembers its own, and as the sunlight reflected off polished wings both civilian and military, something long overdue was beginning to take formation. The formation tightened with quiet precision as the two fighters aligned themselves slightly aft of the airliner's wings, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to remain respectful of civilian airspace boundaries. Lieutenant Ryan Cole adjusted his throttle with measured control, eyes scanning instruments and horizon in disciplined rhythm. This was no longer a holding pattern. This was deliberate positioning. "Razor 2-1, you are cleared to maintain ceremonial escort spacing," came the directive through a command channel rarely used for routine drills. The word ceremonial settled into Ryan's headset with a weight he could not ignore. "Copy, ceremonial escort spacing," he answered, voice steady but altered. His wingman mirrored the adjustment instantly, both aircraft now moving as silent guardians against the vast blue. Inside the commercial cabin, a subtle shift in light drew attention toward the windows. A passenger leaned closer to the glass and gasped softly at the sight of the sleek, gray fighter maintaining formation just beyond the wingtip. Murmurs began to ripple down the aisle, not fearful, but astonished. Laura moved calmly through the cabin, offering reassurance even as she caught her own breath at the view. In seat 16A, Daniel Whitaker watched without outward reaction. The sunlight reflected across the F-35 canopy in a sharp glint, and for a moment the angle of the aircraft against the horizon stirred something distant in his memory. The sky at altitude had a particular shade, a pale endlessness that felt both isolating and sacred. He had known it in different decades, under different circumstances, when the weight of responsibility pressed heavier than gravity. In a command vehicle approaching the base runway, General Marcus Hale adjusted his dress cap and looked toward the horizon through the windshield. "Confirm landing." "Field clearance," he said quietly. "Landing corridor is secured," came the response. "Local media has not been notified." The general gave a slight nod. This was not spectacle. It was recognition. Back in the F-35 cockpit, Ryan's display updated with a secure message. Identity confirmed. Daniel Whitaker, former Air Force Transport Command. Record incident response, winter of 1973. 164 lives preserved during catastrophic systems failure at 30,000 feet. Ryan felt his throat tighten as the sterile data translated into meaning. He glanced once more at the airliner, now aware that the man inside had once carried an entire aircraft through conditions he could only study in training simulations. "Razor 2-1, command continued. You are escorting a pilot whose emergency procedures remain standard in current doctrine." The words struck with clarity. Doctrine. The very manuals Ryan had memorized bore the quiet imprint of the man seated calmly in 16A. Inside the commercial cockpit, the captain received final routing instructions for priority landing clearance. He glanced at the radar screen showing the two fighters holding disciplined position. "We are being honored," he said softly to his first officer. In the cabin, Daniel rested his hands over the worn leather jacket once more, fingers steady, gaze forward. He did not request acknowledgement. He did not expect applause. But as the aircraft began a gradual descent through clean Midwestern air, flanked by two of the most advanced fighters in the world, the sky itself seemed to acknowledge a debt long carried in silence. And at 30,000 feet descending toward home, respect took shape not in words, but in formation. The descent angle adjusted gradually as the airliner eased from 30,000 feet toward its assigned approach corridor, the engines maintaining a smooth, measured hum that now carried a different tone inside the cabin. Passengers leaned closer to their windows, phones forgotten in their laps as the unmistakable silhouettes of the two fighters held steady just beyond the wings. Sunlight flashed along the sharp edges of their frames, precise and disciplined, never drifting, never crowding. Lieutenant Ryan Cole felt the shift in atmosphere even through the reinforced glass of his canopy. He was no longer orbiting a routine civilian flight. He was participating in something ceremonial, something earned long before he ever stepped into a simulator. "Razor 2-1, maintain current spacing through descent," command instructed. "General Hale will be present at touchdown." Ryan swallowed once before responding. "Copy, maintain spacing." His voice carried a steadiness that now came from respect rather than protocol. He stole another glance at the airliner's cockpit windows, imagining the man inside who had once guided an aircraft through conditions severe enough to etch his procedures into modern doctrine. Inside seat 16A, Daniel Whitaker felt the slight pitch of descent and the gentle shift in engine tone. He recognized the rhythm instinctively. Altitude decreasing, air thickening. He rested his palm briefly against the window, not in sentimentality, but in acknowledgement of the sky he had known for most of his life. Across the aisle, a young boy pressed his forehead to the glass, eyes wide at the sight of the fighters. "Mom, they are flying with us," he whispered. His mother nodded, unsure of the reason but sensing importance. Laura paused near Daniel's row and spoke softly. "Sir, the captain asked me to thank you again." Daniel offered a small nod. "He did well," he replied. "He trusted the pattern." The runway at the nearby base shimmered under late afternoon light as General Marcus Hale stepped from the command vehicle and adjusted his uniform coat. Behind him stood a small honor detail, not large, not theatrical, but deliberate. No press, no crowd, just quiet precision. The general looked toward the horizon where a silver shape was beginning to descend, flanked by two gray guardians. In the F-35 cockpit, Ryan heard the final confirmation. Razor flight, break formation at 1,000 feet above ground level. Execute salute pass. The instruction landed with solemn clarity. Ryan inhaled slowly. Copy, salute pass. As the airliner lowered through 2,000 feet, the fighters held their positions for one last measured moment. Then, at the designated altitude, both F-35 aircraft peeled outward in mirrored arcs, engines rising in a controlled crescendo before leveling in synchronized flight along either side of the runway. From the ground, the maneuver looked effortless, almost simple. From the cockpit, Ryan felt the gravity of it settle deep in his chest. The commercial aircraft touched down smoothly, tires meeting runway with a gentle chirp. In seat 16A, Daniel Whitaker felt the familiar tremor of wheels against pavement and closed his eyes briefly. Not in relief, not in nostalgia, but in quiet recognition that the sky, once again, had remembered his name. The aircraft rolled steadily. Along the runway, engines easing down from their sustained hum to a lower, controlled whir as reverse thrust engaged briefly and then released. The long stretch of concrete rushing past before gradually surrendering to a smooth deceleration. Inside the cabin, a ripple of spontaneous applause began somewhere near the middle rows, uncertain at first, then gathering confidence as passengers looked from one another to the windows, where the two fighters completed their salute pass in perfect symmetry before climbing away into the pale afternoon sky. Daniel Whitaker did not join the applause. He remained seated in 16A, hands resting calmly on the worn leather jacket across his lap, eyes forward as the aircraft turned toward a designated military apron rather than the usual civilian terminal. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but carrying a subtle note of reverence. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been cleared for a priority taxi. Please remain seated while we come to a complete stop. He did not explain further, yet the cabin sensed that this was no ordinary arrival. Outside, General Marcus Hale stood at attention near the edge of the tarmac, the late sun casting long shadows across the painted lines. Behind him, a small formation of service members in dress uniforms waited in composed silence. No band, no spectacle, just polished shoes aligned with quiet precision. The airliner slowed to a final halt, engines spooling down into silence that felt heavier than noise. On the flight deck, the captain removed his headset and glanced once more toward Daniel, who had been invited to remain forward until doors opened. Sir, the captain said softly, it would be an honor if you disembarked first. Daniel studied the man's expression, saw sincerity rather than ceremony, and gave a small nod. The cabin door opened with a hydraulic sigh, sunlight pouring into the entryway and illuminating floating dust particles like faint stars suspended in still air. From the top of the stairway, the runway stretched wide and quiet, and beyond it stood General Hale, unmoving, waiting. In the distance, the faint echo of the departing fighters lingered like a memory etched into sky. Daniel stepped forward, descending each metal stair with steady, unhurried movements. The soles of his shoes met the tarmac with a soft, grounded sound that seemed to settle something long suspended between past and present. As he reached the final step, General Hale raised his right hand in a crisp salute, precise and unwavering. The honor detail mirrored the gesture in perfect unison, a line of respect drawn not in words but in posture. Daniel paused, surprised not by the salute itself, but by the quiet intensity behind it. He returned the gesture slowly, not as a performance, but as acknowledgement between men who understood altitude in different eras. Around them, the open runway remained still, the only sound the distant wind moving across miles of American field. No announcement explained the moment. No banner declared it. Yet everyone present understood that this was not about a single landing. It was about a winter decades earlier when one pilot refused to surrender to gravity and carried 164 souls safely through the sky. And now, Beneath a calm Midwestern sun, the horizon had come to meet him. The salute held for several steady seconds, long enough for the quiet weight of it to settle across the open runway. And when General Marcus Hale lowered his hand, he did not step back immediately. He took one measured pace forward instead, stopping just short of Daniel Whitaker, as if acknowledging a line that only those who had worn wings truly understood. "Captain Whitaker," the general said, his voice low but carrying clearly across the tarmac. "On behalf of the United States Air Force, welcome home." The words were simple, absent of flourish, yet they carried decades within them. Daniel regarded the general with calm blue eyes that had once scanned storm systems and frozen horizons. "Thank you, General," he replied, his tone steady, unembellished. Around them, the small honor detail remained motionless, dress uniforms pressed sharp against the afternoon light. Behind the aircraft, passengers began to disembark in respectful silence, many pausing at the top of the stairway as they took in the unexpected ceremony below. Some whispered to one another. Others simply watched, sensing that they were witnessing something rare. Laura Mitchell stood just inside the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame, her earlier assumptions replaced entirely by quiet admiration. From the far end of the apron, Lieutenant Ryan Cole approached at a brisk but controlled pace, helmet tucked under his arm, flight suit still carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and warm electronics. He slowed as he drew near, eyes fixed on the older man whose name had moved entire command channels into motion. Ryan stopped a respectful distance away and came to attention without being instructed. Daniel turned slightly, noticing the young pilot's posture. For a brief moment, decades seemed to overlap between them. The seasoned transport commander and the advanced fighter pilot standing under the same wide American sky. Ryan raised his hand in a crisp salute, sharper than any he had executed in training, because this one was not graded or observed for form. It was offered. Daniel returned the gesture once more, not as a relic of protocol, but as acknowledgement of continuity. The general allowed the silence to linger before speaking again. "Your emergency response procedures from 1973 are still referenced in transport command manuals," he said evenly. "Every pilot who studies high-altitude systems failure learns from what you did." Daniel's expression did not change dramatically, yet something softened behind his eyes. "It was a crew effort," he replied. "We trusted the checklist. And we trusted each other." The general inclined his head slightly. 164 families are grateful for that trust," he said. A faint breeze crossed the runway, lifting the edge of Daniel's jacket and carrying with it the distant echo of aircraft engines fading into the horizon. No medals were presented. No speeches extended beyond what was necessary. Yet in that open space of concrete and sky, something profound had been restored. Not fame, not spectacle, but recognition. As the passengers continued down the stairs and the honor detail finally relaxed from rigid stillness, Daniel Whitaker stood quietly at the center of it all, a man who had once carried an aircraft through impossible air and had done so without ever asking the world to remember. And now, as the sun dipped lower across the fields beyond the base, the sky that had tested him had chosen to salute him in return. The runway gradually returned to its ordinary rhythm as ground crews resumed measured movement and the last passengers cleared the stairway, yet the space around Daniel Whitaker remained quietly set apart, as if the afternoon itself had drawn a respectful perimeter. General Marcus Hale stepped beside him, no longer in rigid salute, but still carrying the bearing of command. "We have a small reception room prepared, if you would allow us a few minutes," the general said with restrained courtesy. Daniel glanced once more across the open field where heat shimmered above concrete and distant hangars reflected soft gold light. "A few minutes," he agreed. Lieutenant Ryan Cole followed at a respectful distance, helmet still tucked under his arm, eyes absorbing every detail of the man whose procedures he had studied in training modules without ever imagining he would meet the author in person. Inside the modest operations building overlooking the runway, framed photographs lined the walls, each capturing aircraft in different eras of American aviation. Daniel paused briefly before a black and white image of a heavy transport aircraft banking through winter clouds. He recognized the model instantly, the shape of its wings etched permanently into memory. Ryan noticed the pause. "Sir," he said carefully, voice steady but earnest. "We train on your emergency descent protocol every year." Daniel turned slightly toward him. "It was not mine alone," he replied. "It belonged to the crew that trusted it." The general observed the exchange without interruption, understanding that what was unfolding was not ceremony but transmission. Outside the wide window, the two F-35 fighters could be seen taxiing back toward their hangars, sleek forms gliding with quiet authority. Ryan followed Daniel's gaze. "Those jets represent the future," he said. Daniel gave a faint, knowing nod. "And the future flies best when it remembers the lessons of thin air," he answered. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective. The general cleared his throat gently. "Captain Whitaker, there is no medal to present today," he said. "What you carried through that winter flight was never about decoration." Daniel met his eyes. "It was about getting them home," he said simply. The words held no drama, only truth. In the hallway beyond the reception room, a few service members paused quietly, aware that history was standing a few yards away in civilian clothes. No cameras clicked. No headlines formed. Yet the respect in the room was palpable, steady as altitude. Ryan finally allowed himself a small, humbled smile. "Sir, when we formed up on your wing today," he said, "it was the most meaningful flight of my career." Daniel studied the young pilot's face and saw in it the same determination he once carried into turbulent skies. "Then fly it forward," he said gently. "That is how respect stays alive." Outside, the sun lowered another degree toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the base. The day would close like any other. Aircraft refueled, reports filed, routines resumed. But for those who stood on that runway and in that quiet room, something enduring had shifted. Not because of spectacle, but because the standard had been seen up close. And as the light faded over the American heartland, one lesson settled as steady as a compass heading. Some pilots do not seek recognition. They simply set it. The reception room gradually emptied as duty schedules called officers back to hangars and briefing rooms, yet the atmosphere lingered with a quiet gravity that refused to dissipate. Daniel Whitaker stood near the window overlooking the runway, hands folded loosely behind his back, posture relaxed but naturally aligned, as if he still felt the subtle hum of engines beneath his feet. Outside, ground crews guided the two F-35 aircraft into their designated shelters, the sleek silhouettes disappearing into shadowed hangars built for the future of flight. Lieutenant Ryan Cole remained in the room a moment longer than necessary, aware that opportunities like this did not repeat themselves. He approached Daniel carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. "Sir," Ryan began, his voice steady yet reflective, "when we train, everything is measured in metrics. Speed, altitude, fuel efficiency. But today did not feel like a metric." Daniel allowed himself a faint smile, lines at the corners of his eyes deepening with memory rather than age. "The sky does not measure in numbers alone," he replied. "It measures in decisions. And in trust." Ryan nodded slowly, absorbing the simplicity of the statement. In another era, Daniel had stood inside vibrating fuselages and listened to systems falter while crews looked toward him for direction. The memory surfaced quietly now, not as a flash of drama, but as a steady sequence of disciplined actions. 30,000 feet above a winter storm, instrument panels glowing dim through icy haze, voices in the cockpit calm but edged with urgency. He had not felt heroic. He had felt responsible. That difference had shaped everything. General Marcus Hale re-entered the room after speaking briefly with base operations. "Your transportation is ready," he said respectfully. "We can arrange a direct transfer to your final destination, or you may continue with your commercial itinerary. The choice is yours." Daniel considered the offer, eyes drifting once more to the runway where civilian and military paths had intersected. "For a single afternoon. I will continue as planned," he answered. "The passengers deserve their arrival to remain ordinary." The general inclined his head in understanding. "Understood." Outside, the commercial aircraft was already being prepared for departure toward its original terminal. Routine would resume. Schedules would reassert themselves. Yet something intangible had shifted among those who had witnessed the formation in the sky. Ryan extended his hand, not as a subordinate seeking validation, but as a pilot acknowledging lineage. Daniel shook it firmly, grip steady despite the years. Fly with humility, Daniel said quietly. Technology evolves. Judgment must remain. Ryan felt the words settle deeper than any tactical briefing he had ever received. As Daniel stepped toward the exit, the late sun cast long amber streaks across the concrete, and for a brief instant his silhouette aligned with the distant hangar doors where advanced aircraft rested in silence. The future stood sheltered there, powerful and precise. Yet its foundation had been laid decades earlier by men who navigated thinner margins with heavier burdens. The door closed softly behind him, and the room seemed larger in his absence. General Hale looked toward Ryan. "Remember this day," he said simply. Ryan nodded. Outside, the sky stretched wide and calm, carrying no trace of ceremony, only the quiet continuity of flight. And somewhere beyond the fading light, the horizon held steady, as it always had, waiting for the next pilot to honor it. The civilian terminal welcomed them with the familiar sounds of rolling luggage and distant boarding calls, a contrast to the measured stillness of the runway they had just left behind. Daniel Whitaker walked through the concourse without escort now, blending back into the quiet anonymity he had worn for years. Travelers moved around him unaware that only minutes earlier the sky itself had aligned in disciplined formation on his behalf. Laura Mitchell caught up briefly near the gate entrance, her expression warm but restrained. "Sir, it was an honor to have you on board," she said sincerely. Daniel inclined his head with the same humility he had carried through cockpit doors decades earlier. "You kept the cabin calm," he replied. "That matters more than most people realize." She smiled softly, understanding that leadership was not always seated in the left chair of a flight deck. Across the airfield, Lieutenant Ryan Cole stood on the edge of the tarmac watching the commercial aircraft prepare to taxi toward its civilian gate. The roar of his fighter's engines had long since faded, yet the moment still echoed in his thoughts. He replayed the formation in his mind, the precise spacing, the sunlight flashing off metal wings, and the realization that the procedures he studied had been written not in theory, but in lived experience at altitude. General Marcus Hale joined him quietly, hands clasped behind his back. "You felt it," the general observed, not as a question but as recognition. Ryan nodded once. "Yes, sir. It was different." The general's gaze followed the departing aircraft. "History is rarely loud," he said. "It moves quietly, carried by those who do not ask for credit." The commercial jet began its final taxi, turning gently toward the terminal as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Inside seat 16A, Daniel settled once more into his place among ordinary passengers. A child across the aisle offered him a shy smile, unaware of doctrine manuals or command channels, only remembering the sight of silver fighters gliding beside their wing. Daniel returned the smile faintly, eyes drifting toward the window where the sky stretched vast and open above the airfield. He did not dwell on the past. The winter storm, the flickering instruments, the weight of 164 lives resting on calm decision making at 30,000 feet had long ago been folded into memory without bitterness or pride. Responsibility had been the only compass that day. Outside, the two F-35 aircraft were secured within their hangars, technicians performing routine inspections under fluorescent lights. Tomorrow they would launch again for drills, patrols, and missions defined by new challenges. Yet for those pilots, the horizon now held a deeper dimension. It was not just a boundary to cross, but a standard to uphold. As the sun dipped lower and cast a golden wash across the control tower windows, the day returned to its ordinary cadence. Boarding calls resumed. Engines spooled. Schedules advanced. But somewhere between runway and sky, a quiet acknowledgement had been made, not through speeches or headlines, but through disciplined wings holding position in respectful silence. And as the commercial aircraft eased toward its gate, Daniel Whitaker remained what he had always been, a pilot who once chose steadiness over fear, trust over panic, and duty over recognition, setting a course that others would follow long after contrails faded. Into open air. The aircraft door finally opened at the civilian gate, and passengers rose with the familiar impatience of travelers eager to reclaim their routines, yet something in the cabin remained quieter than usual. Daniel Whitaker waited until the aisle cleared before standing, retrieving his worn leather jacket with the same deliberate care he once applied to checklists at altitude. Outside the window, the evening sky stretched in soft bands of amber and fading blue, contrails dissolving into silence above the terminal roof. No formation waited there now. No honor detail stood at attention. The moment on the runway had already settled into memory. As he stepped into the jet bridge, the low hum of airport ventilation replaced the distant echo of engines, and ordinary life resumed its steady rhythm. A few passengers glanced back at him with subtle recognition, not fully understanding what they had witnessed, only sensing that the quiet man in seat 16A carried something weightier than luggage. In the distance, on the far side of the airfield, Lieutenant Ryan Cole stood alone beside his aircraft as maintenance crews completed post-flight checks under bright, white hangar lights. He removed his gloves slowly, eyes tracing the sleek lines of the fighter's wings. He understood now that speed and technology were not the highest measures of aviation. Judgment was. Humility was. The ability to remain steady when instruments flickered and fear pressed close. General Marcus Hale approached him once more before departing the base for the evening. "You will brief your squadron tomorrow," the general said calmly. "Not about formation spacing. About why we formed at all." Ryan nodded, the weight of responsibility settling differently than before. "Yes, sir." The general placed a firm hand on his shoulder for a brief second, then walked away without further instruction. Back inside the terminal, Daniel paused near a large window overlooking the field. For a moment, he allowed himself to watch a departing aircraft climb into the darkening sky, its lights blinking steadily as it rose through layers of air he knew by feel rather than sight. The memory of that winter flight did not return with drama. It returned with clarity. The checklist spoken calmly. The crew trusting each other without hesitation. The steady descent through uncertainty until wheels met runway, and 164 lives stepped safely onto solid ground. He had never sought recognition for. That day, he had only sought completion of duty. Now, decades later, recognition had arrived not in applause, but in disciplined wings holding respectful distance. He adjusted his jacket and turned toward the exit, blending once more into the flow of travelers beneath fluorescent lights and rolling departure boards. Outside, the last trace of sunlight faded beyond the horizon, leaving the sky vast and unmarked. Yet somewhere above the quiet fields and runways, the standard remained. Some men raised their voices. Others raised the bar. And when the sky remembers their name, it does so not with noise, but with formation.